Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 has been one of my most highly anticipated games. I really liked the first one, recently played through it again, and I'm so happy that it's here. And I'm also happy to report that it is a very well optimized game. It's a perfect example of a good PC game launch. How well optimized is it? Well, here we're running the game at 4K native with DLAA on top, and we've maxed out the graphical settings. We've set everything to experimental, which if you know anything about the first game, experimental was pretty much almost impossible to run back in the day. And it's usually reserved with future hardware in mind. The game actually tells you when you accept those settings. But as you can see here, yeah, we're using a 4090, which is a pretty high-end GPU, but we're able to stay at 60 or above, or a little bit below, depending on the area, pretty much most of the time, which is great. And the game looks absolutely fantastic. Now we're going to look at some of the graphical settings because I went through them to kind of point out some of the more demanding ones and some of the tweaks that you can make. But the game also comes with obviously DLSS and also FSR. And I'm also happy to report that FSR actually does a really good job in this game. Now, yeah, it's not as good and as consistent as DLSS, but it's actually really good. And speaking of which, I have some suggestions and some tweaks that you can make. Now the first one is I went through the files of the game, and it comes packaged with DLSS 3.7, which isn't the latest. The latest is 3.10, so I used DLSS Swapper to inject the latest 3.10 in the game. And then I used Nvidia Profile Inspector to force preset K, which should theoretically force the transformer model in the game. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at FSR and DLSS and see how they compare together. One thing I highly recommend you guys do is lower the sharpness slider all the way down because it will be in the middle by default and it can introduce quite a bit of flicker actually. But here we have FSR quality at 4K with experimental setting. It actually looks pretty good. Now, normally we do see a bit of flicker or noise, especially with heavy foliage games. And while there is a little bit of that, I would say overall it's pretty stable. I think it actually looks pretty good. And if we were to compare that to DLSS 3.7, which comes packaged with the game, we have FSR quality on the left and DLSS quality on the right, and I've zoomed in by 200% just so that I can hopefully overcome YouTube's compression. But as you can see, the image is definitely less stable on FSR. It's a bit more flicker, but I would say it's not too bad. I mean, I'm usually bothered by flicker, and I don't think it's that bad. You would definitely get used to it. And I think overall, the image quality looks pretty good with FSR. It's quite impressive, actually. But what about my DLSS that I modded in with preset K? Does it look any different? Well, guys, you tell me. On the left, we have DLSS 3.7 quality, which comes packaged with the game. And on the right, we have the DLSS latest one with the preset K forced through Profile Inspector. And I don't know, to me, they look very comparable. They both look great, very stable. So I don't think I would worry too much about that. I think the DLSS that comes packaged with the game definitely looks really, really nice. And as a final point of comparison, here's FSR performance versus DLSS performance. Now here it looks like FSR performance on the left kind of falls apart, is very flickery, quite unstable, whereas DLSS performance actually is pretty stable. If anything, I would say it's a bit more blurry because we're upscaling from such a low resolution. But overall, actually, it's definitely a lot more stable. But what do you guys think? Leave a comment down below and let me know. In this part of the video, I wanted to discuss the experimental preset. I've been vocal against people feeling the need to have to max out every graphical setting in order to be able to enjoy the game. And oftentimes, more often than not actually, maxing out graphical settings has diminishing returns. And in this game, well, it's not really so straightforward because experimental actually can make quite a difference, especially with the pop-in. I mean, this game stretches out as far as the eye can see with a lot of very fine detail, and you can see here with the experimental preset the vegetation draw distance is insane. As a matter of fact, you can see where it kind of begins to cut off and detail begins to drop. It's quite far, and to me that is the biggest impact that some of the experimental settings have. For example, If we drop to the Ultra preset, the draw distance is noticeably reduced, although it still looks really good and quite a lot of detail. And we also went from 62 FPS all the way to 75 FPS. That's quite a big gain. And Ultra preset, by the way, guys, looks phenomenal as well. But again, if you're someone like me who likes large vegetation draw distances, well, I kind of isolated the settings that affect that the most. There's two settings that can affect vegetation draw distance, and we're currently at 75 FPS, and the two settings are shadows and vegetation detail. And if you set both of those to experimental, well, you get the long distance vegetation draw, and you also get the shadows, which adds depth to the grass, the trees, and the rocks, and everything around it. And if you remember, with everything on experimental, we were getting around 60 FPS, and by just keeping these two settings into experimental, we're all the way up to 67. So we're kind of in between Ultra preset and experimental preset. So I think it's important to leave these two settings on experimental if you have the performance to spare. After all, this time around in this game, we have upscaling. We have DLSS and FSR. And we saw how good of a job DLSS actually does, that even if you were to go to DLSS performance, right, the game still looks really nice, and you go from 65 FPS or whatever it was all the way up to close to 110. So I think this time around you can increase some of the settings and make up that difference with upscaling if possible. Now, I also went through all the graphical settings to see which ones are the most demanding. And this is no benchmarking or anything like that, but I wanted to point out 3 settings that are the most demanding and what I recommend you set them to. Alright, so let's flip back to native 4K DLAA experimental. And the first setting is global illumination. At maxed out, we're at 61 FPS. If we go to low, we jump up by 12 FPS, all the way to 71. And if we go from low to medium in GI, we drop by 1 FPS. I personally recommend medium because it looks really good and the FPS gain is pretty big. But if we go from medium to high, we go down to 67 FPS, and the difference isn't massive. That's why I recommend medium. And then if you go up to ultra, it drops almost as close to experimental settings. So I would recommend global illumination to medium if you want to gain some extra performance. The next very demanding setting is shadows, and this one's a bit tricky. We're back to 61 FPS at experimental settings, and if we drop shadows to low, we gain about 8 FPS, but as you can see, shadows look awful. There's so much depth missing from the image now, and you have the flickering in the back. It doesn't look very good. Well, let's take a look at medium. Well, that cost us about 2 to 3 FPS, and I would say this is probably the minimum that I would go. It definitely looks better, but we still have some flickering shadows in the distance, but still much better than low. And if we go to high, well, the FPS stays more or less the same, except that we get more stable shadows in the back. If you look at the trees, they're not as flickery. And then if we go to ultra, we drop about 1 FPS. So I would recommend actually sticking with either high or ultra. I think both look pretty good, probably ultra, and then medium if you really need that extra performance. The next setting is vegetation quality, which is one of my favorites actually, and at experimental we're at 61, and if we drop to low, well, as you can see, it looks awful, almost like shadows on low, but we do gain a bit of performance, about 7 FPS or so. And if we go to medium, it does look much better, and we do gain about an FPS or 2, although still doesn't look necessarily as great as it can. Now if we go to vegetation high, it costs us about an FPS or so, but it does look noticeably better. So I would say the vegetation high would be my minimum, but I still think ultra is probably better because it only costs another FPS and it does look noticeably better. Vegetation is a big part of this game in my opinion. I'd say the game is a very good PC port. It's quite well optimized, and whether you're playing like this on an RTX 4090 at 4K ultra graphical preset and DLSS set to quality, or on a 6800 XT at 4K ultra graphical preset and FSR set to quality, I think you're going to have a really good time, and you can make some tweaks into the settings and use upscaling to enjoy the game. Now, I figured the 6800 XT would be doing a little bit better, so maybe it seems the game could possibly run a little bit better on Nvidia GPUs. I might have to look more into that, but just at a glance, that's what it looks like. The first game was also like that, but that was a DX11 game, so it was kind of expected. But this one is not, so very interesting. But still, I still think it runs really well. Either way, there's no stutters. The game's really smooth. Well guys, I guess to put a lid on this video, the way I'm personally playing the game is just like this, what you're looking at on the screen. 4K, everything on experimental and DLSS quality. I think going for experimental shadows and vegetation quality, if you can make that happen and use upscaling, I think it'll probably be worth it because, like I said, this game stretches out as far as the eye can see. And it keeps popping to a minimum. The game looks beautiful. I'm happy to see another big budget game that doesn't use Unreal Engine 5 and runs extremely well. So I'm very happy about that. What I would have loved to have seen was, at the very least, FSR frame generation. Ideally, DLSS and FSR frame generation. A game like this would stand to benefit greatly from that technology because even though it's not particularly CPU heavy, although I haven't been to a big city yet, it is a single player, fairly slower paced game that would benefit greatly from such a technology. But either way, at least the FSR and DLSS implementation is pretty good. The game looks absolutely gorgeous. And HDR is not perfect. We have some high black level rays, but hopefully that can be fixed. Either way though, I think they've done a much better job with this game as far as the animation quality and characters, and some of the writing as well has been kind of hilarious. You can tell that it's a step up from the previous game. Although the previous game was excellent, I do suggest playing it. It still holds up graphically actually really, really well to this day. But yeah, very excited to keep playing this game. I love the first one and continue the story of Henry and see where it takes us. But what do you guys think? Leave a comment down below. Let me know. Give the video a like if you liked it, and consider subscribing if you want to see more similar content. I appreciate you guys. Bye-bye.
Shit! You fucking cunts! Do you know who I am? No, we fucking don't! I'm Sir Hans Capon of Perkstein, heir to Ratai.